The smoke from the signal fires rose into the pale spring sky on the morning of May 1st, 1351, thin columns of gray ascending from hilltops across the devastated landscape of Yorkshire, each fire representing a village or hamlet where survivors had emerged from the winter of death and were now calling out to their neighbors, trying to determine who else had lived through the pestilence that had swept across England like the wrath of God, killing without mercy or reason, taking perhaps half the kingdoms as people in the span of 18 terrible months, and leaving behind a world so transformed that those who remained could barely recognize it as the same realm they had inhabited before the plague came. From the tower of St. Michael's Church in the market town of Helmsley, Brother Edmund stood watch over the fires he could see dotting the hills and valleys in every direction, counting them carefully and marking their locations on the crude map he had drawn, trying to compile an accounting of which settlements still contained living souls, and which had been completely extinguished, which parishes still had priests, and which had been left without spiritual shepherds, which manors still had lords, and which had become ownerless lands that would need new governance if they were to be brought back into productive use. Brother Edmund was one of only 3 monks who had survived from the priory that had once housed 20, and he had taken it upon himself to organize this gathering of survivors, to use the ancient system of signal fires that had once warned of Viking raids and Scottish invasions to now serve a different purpose, to call together those who remained, so that they might count themselves, might share their knowledge, and their resources might begin the overwhelming task of rebuilding a civilization that had come perilously close to complete collapse in the face of the Black Death. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The gathering that Brother Edmund had organized was to take place in Helmsley on the Feast of Pentecost, 7 weeks after Easter, giving time for word to spread through the scattered survivors and for people to make their way to the town from the surrounding countryside. Helmsley had been chosen because it was centrally located in the region, because it had a market square large enough to accommodate a crowd, because its priory could provide some organizational structure and record-keeping capability, and because it had suffered somewhat less severely than many surrounding areas, retaining perhaps 40% of its pre-plague population, where some villages had been reduced to 1/10 or less of their former numbers. The town that had once housed perhaps 800 souls now held perhaps 300, but this was enough to maintain basic functions. There were still craftsmen, working merchants, trading farmers, bringing produce to market, a semblance of normal economic life continuing amid the pervasive atmosphere of grief and loss and profound uncertainty about the future. Brother Edmund had sent riders to every village and manor within a day's journey of Helmsley, carrying messages written in Latin for those few who could read and verbal messages for the many who could not, calling people to gather on Pentecost, to share information, to discuss common problems, to coordinate responses to the crisis that they all faced. The responses had been mixed. Some communities had sent word that they would send representatives, grateful for any attempt to organize collective action, while others had not responded at all either, because they had ceased to exist or because they were too overwhelmed with immediate survival to think about larger coordination, or perhaps because they distrusted any gathering that might expose them to further contagion. for the fear of the plague remained intense even though the dying had largely stopped by the previous autumn. Brother Edmund himself was 43 years old, a man who had entered the priory as a young novice, and who had spent his entire adult life in religious service, first as a simple monk devoted to prayer and study, then as the priory's librarian and keeper of records, and finally, by terrible necessity, as one of the few surviving members of a community that had been decimated by the plague. The pestilence had struck the priory in October of 1349, brought by a traveling friar who had taken ill while visiting, and who had died within 3 days of developing symptoms. From that first case, the disease had spread through the close-quartered community with devastating efficiency, taking the prior and the sub-prior and most of the brothers, sparing only Edmund and 2 younger monks who, for reasons they could not understand, had either never fallen ill or had developed only mild symptoms and had recovered. The months that followed had been a trial of faith for Brother Edmund that had shaken him to his core. He had watched holy men die in agony, their bodies swollen and discolored, their minds ravaged by fever, their deaths offering no evidence of divine favor or spiritual consolation. He had performed the burial services for his brothers, laying them to rest in graves that he had dug with his own hands, because there was no one else to do it. He had maintained the divine office as best he could with only 2 other voices to join his own in the prayers that were supposed to be chanted by a full choir of 20. And he had struggled with questions that had no answers. Why had God allowed this? What sin could possibly warrant such punishment? Why had the righteous suffered alongside the wicked? What was the purpose of survival if everything that had given life meaning had been destroyed? But Edmund was a practical man as well as a spiritual one, and as the shock of the plague wore off and the business of continuing became unavoidable, he had turned his attention to practical matters. The priory's lands still needed to be managed, though most of the lay brothers and servants who had worked them were dead. The priory's role in the community as a center of learning and record-keeping and spiritual guidance needed to be maintained if possible. And someone needed to think about how the scattered survivors of the plague could be helped to organize themselves to share resources and knowledge to begin the work of recovery that would otherwise be left to isolated individuals and communities struggling in ignorance of each other's situations and capabilities. The idea of gathering the survivors had come to Edmund during the long winter months when travel was difficult, and when each community was isolated and focused on simply enduring until spring. He had spent those months reading in the priory's library, looking for precedents and guidance, finding some comfort in the accounts of how communities had responded to earlier disasters, the Viking invasions, the Norman conquest famines, and plagues of earlier centuries. What these histories suggested was that recovery was possible, that communities could rebuild from even severe losses, but that the process went better when there was coordination and communication, when knowledge and resources could be shared, when isolation and fragmentation could be overcome through conscious effort at cooperation and mutual support. As spring arrived and travel became possible again, Edmund had begun to implement his plan, sending out his messengers, preparing the priory to host the gathering, organizing the agenda of topics that would need to be discussed, compiling what information he could about the state of different communities and the magnitude of the losses they had suffered. The task was daunting in its scope and complexity, for the plague had affected every aspect of society and had created problems that had no obvious solutions. and that would require creativity and flexibility and compromise if they were to be addressed at all successfully. On the morning of Pentecost, as the church bells of St. Michael's rang out across, Helmsley, calling the faithful to mass people, began arriving in the market square, coming on foot and on horseback in small groups and as individuals representing the scattered survivors from dozens of communities across Yorkshire. They came from villages that had been reduced to a handful of families, from manors where the lords had died and left confused, heirs or no heirs at all from isolated farms where individual families had survived in near-complete isolation through the winter. They came seeking information and assistance, seeking connection with others who had endured the same catastrophe, seeking some sense that recovery might be possible, and that they were not alone in facing the overwhelming challenges of rebuilding. Brother Edmund greeted the arrivals as they came, recording their names and their origins in the careful script he had perfected over decades of monastic record-keeping, asking brief questions about conditions in their home communities, trying to compile a picture of the overall situation. What emerged from these conversations was both sobering and illuminating. The mortality had been extraordinarily high. Most communities had lost half to two-thirds of their population, and some had lost far more. Entire villages had been abandoned, their survivors having fled to other settlements or having died to the last person. Many manors had lost their lords and were effectively ownerless. Countless families had been extinguished entirely, with no surviving members to claim property or to maintain family holdings. But the conversations also revealed resilience and adaptation. People had found ways to survive, had shown remarkable creativity in dealing with the absence of traditional authorities, and structures had begun to make arrangements that violated the old customs, but that made sense in the changed circumstances. Peasants who had been bound to their lords, lands through serfdom, had simply left and claimed better lands elsewhere, where labor was so scarce that no one questioned their right to settle. Craftsmen who would never have been able to establish independent workshops in the crowded pre-plague economy had set themselves up in business in nearly empty towns. Women who would have had no property rights or economic autonomy had become heads of households and managers of lands. The rigid hierarchies and rules that had governed medieval society were eroding in the face of demographic catastrophe, and what was emerging, however haltingly and uncertainly, was something more fluid and more flexible. The gathering formally began with a Mass celebrated by Brother Edmund in St. Michael's Church, packed with survivors who filled perhaps a third of the pews that had once been crowded every Sunday with worshippers. The service was somber, focused on prayers for the dead and on petitions for divine guidance in the difficult times ahead, but it was also in some sense hopeful, a demonstration that the forms and rituals of Christianity endured even when so much else had been swept away, that the community of believers continued despite devastating losses. Edmund's sermon, delivered in English rather than Latin so that all could understand, addressed directly the questions of faith and meaning that everyone struggled with, acknowledging the difficulty of maintaining belief in divine providence when providence seemed to have failed so catastrophically, but also affirming that faith was not dependent on understanding, that God's purposes remained mysterious, but that the duty of believers was to continue in faith and in service, regardless of whether they could comprehend the reasons for their suffering. After the Mass, the gathered survivors moved to the market square where benches and tables had been set up and where Brother Edmund had organized the day's discussions. He had divided the agenda into several broad topics that he believed needed collective attention: the agricultural situation and how to ensure adequate food production with drastically reduced labor forces, the question of lordship and governance in communities where traditional authorities were dead or absent, the problem of abandoned lands and properties, and how to allocate them fairly and productively, the spiritual needs of communities left without priests, the practical needs for craftsmen and skilled workers, and the longer-term question of how to rebuild population and restore communities to viability. The first discussion concerned agriculture, the most immediately critical issue, since failure to plant and harvest adequately would mean starvation, regardless of whatever other problems were solved. A farmer named William from the village of Revo spoke first, describing the situation in his community where perhaps 20 people remained from a pre-plague population of more than 100. They had land enough for 4 or 5 times their number, he explained, but not nearly enough hands to work at all. They had decided to focus their efforts on the best fields closest to the village, letting the rest lie fallow or converting it to pasture for livestock, which required far less labor than grain cultivation. They had also abandoned the traditional open field system where each family worked scattered strips of land, instead consolidating holdings so that each household worked a contiguous block that could be managed more efficiently. This account resonated with many others in the gathering who described similar adaptations in their own communities. The consensus that emerged was that the old agricultural system designed for a populous countryside, where every bit of land needed to be worked intensively to feed everyone, no longer made sense when land was abundant and labor was scarce. Better to work less land more efficiently, to focus on the most productive fields, to shift from labor-intensive crops to livestock farming where possible, to allow individuals to claim larger holdings if they could work them. These changes represented a fundamental transformation of the medieval agricultural economy, but they seemed both necessary and beneficial, offering survivors the possibility of greater prosperity even as overall production declined. The discussion of lordship and governance was more contentious and more complex. In the pre-plague world, the system of feudal relationships had been clear and well established. Peasants owed service and rent to lords who held land from greater lords who owed service to the king, a pyramid of obligations that provided order and structure to society. But the plague had shattered many of these relationships. Lords had died without clear heirs, creating uncertainty about who held authority and who owed what to whom. Peasants who had owed service to dead lords were claiming independence or acknowledging new lords on whatever terms they could negotiate. In some areas, royal officials or surviving nobles were attempting to reimpose the old system, while in others the vacuum of authority had led to something approaching anarchy. A knight named Sir Robert from the manor of Sproxton spoke about his attempts to manage lands that had belonged to his uncle, who had died along with both his sons, leaving Sir Robert as the nearest male relative, and therefore the heir. But Sir Robert found that the surviving peasants on the lands were resistant to acknowledging his authority, claiming that the old obligations had died with the old lord, and that they would work the land only on new terms that were far more favorable to them than the traditional arrangements. Sir Robert had faced a choice. He could attempt to enforce the old obligations, which might drive the peasants away to other lords who were more accommodating, leaving him with empty lands and no income, or he could accept the new terms which would give him some income and some productive land, but would mean abandoning the traditional rights and privileges of his position. Sir Robert's dilemma was one that many landowners faced, and the discussion revealed a range of responses. Some lords were attempting to maintain traditional arrangements, using whatever force and authority they could muster to compel peasants to fulfill their obligations. Others were being more flexible, reducing rents and labor service requirements, offering better terms to keep their tenants from leaving. Still others had simply abandoned their lands or sold them, unable or unwilling to deal with the changed circumstances. The gathering could not resolve these conflicts or impose a uniform solution, but the discussion at least allowed people to understand the range of approaches being tried and the various consequences that were emerging. The question of abandoned lands and properties was related to the lordship question, but had its own complications. All across the region there were cottages and workshops and fields, and even entire villages that had been left ownerless when their inhabitants died without heirs. In the pre-plague world, such properties would have reverted to the lord or to the king, to be reallocated according to the usual feudal procedures. But with so much property abandoned and with traditional authorities often unable or unwilling to exercise their theoretical rights, many survivors were simply claiming vacant properties for themselves, moving into better cottages than they had occupied before, taking over workshops and tools and equipment, expanding their land holdings into empty fields. Brother Edmund raised the question of whether this informal reallocation should be regularized or whether it should be left to sort itself out through custom and practice. A merchant from Helmsley named Thomas argued that some attempts should be made to record claims and to establish clear ownership, if only to prevent future disputes when population recovered and when multiple people might claim the same property. Others argued that record keeping was beyond the capability of most communities, and that attempting to impose formal procedures would only create new conflicts and confusion. The gathering eventually agreed to recommend that communities should at least try to keep informal records of who had claimed what properties to be formalized later when circumstances permitted, but that the immediate priority was to get abandoned properties back into productive use by whoever was willing and able to use them, with questions of formal ownership deferred to a less chaotic time. The spiritual needs of the survivors proved to be one of the most difficult issues to address. Many parishes had lost their priests, and replacing them was not simple. The church had lost huge numbers of clergy to the plague. Some estimates suggested that half the priests in England had died, and the survivors were spread thin, trying to serve the parishes that remained. Moreover, the quality of new priests being ordained was often questionable, as the church relaxed its standards in the desperate attempt to fill vacant positions, ordaining men who would never have been acceptable in normal times. Brother Edmund acknowledged these problems, but could offer no immediate solutions beyond promising to write to the bishop requesting that priests be assigned to the most severely underserved areas, and suggesting that in the meantime communities should organize their own prayer services and religious observances as best they could under lay leadership. The need for craftsmen and skilled workers was acute across the region. Blacksmiths, carpenters, millers, weavers, and numerous other specialized workers had died in the plague, and their skills could not easily be replaced. A blacksmith from the village of Kirkby Moorside described how he was the only smith remaining in an area that had previously supported four, and he was overwhelmed with work and able to charge prices that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Others told similar stories of craftsmen who found themselves in unprecedented demand and able to command high wages and favorable working conditions. Some saw this as a positive development, a sign that skilled workers were finally being valued appropriately, while others worried about the social disruption caused by people of humble origins suddenly accumulating wealth and status that threatened traditional hierarchies. The question of how to rebuild population was perhaps the most sensitive and the most fundamental. Everyone recognized that the long-term viability of communities depended on having enough people to maintain social structures, to defend against threats, to work the land and practice the trades, and perform all the countless tasks that civilization required. But how to increase population when so many potential parents had died was not obvious. Marriage rates had actually declined in many areas in the immediate aftermath of the plague, as traumatized survivors struggled with grief and as the normal social mechanisms for arranging marriages had been disrupted. Moreover, the epidemic had created a gender imbalance in some communities. In areas where the plague had struck men harder, there were many widows but few available men to marry them, while in other areas the situation was reversed. A widow named Eleanor from the village of Hutton-le-Hole spoke about her situation as representative of many women's experiences. She had lost her husband and her 3 children to the plague, and she was now living alone on a small holding, trying to manage it by herself despite having no training or experience in farm management, which had been her husband's responsibility in their traditional division of labor. She had received several marriage proposals from men who wanted to acquire her land, but she was reluctant to remarry, having loved her dead husband and finding the prospect of a marriage based purely on economic considerations distasteful. Yet she recognized that she would struggle to manage alone, and that marriage to a capable farmer would make practical sense. Her dilemma was one that many widows and widowers faced, trying to balance emotional considerations with practical necessities. The discussions continued through the day and into the evening, with various speakers sharing their experiences and perspectives, with Brother Edmund trying to synthesize what was being said and to identify common themes and practical recommendations. What emerged was not a comprehensive plan for recovery. The situation was too complex and too fluid for that, but rather a set of principles and practices that seemed to be working in various communities, and that might be adopted more widely. The gathering also served the important function of simply bringing people together, of allowing them to see that they were not alone in their struggles, that others were facing similar challenges, that community and cooperation were still possible even in the devastated post-plague world. As the formal gathering concluded with evening prayers in the church, Brother Edmund felt a cautious optimism that he had not experienced in the long dark months since the plague. The discussions had revealed enormous problems and no easy answers, but they had also revealed resilience and creativity, and a determination to continue. People were adapting, were finding ways to make the new world work, were slowly rebuilding, despite the odds against them. It would take years, perhaps generations, to truly recover from the plague, but recovery seemed possible rather than hopeless, a long, difficult journey rather than an impossible task. The days following the formal gathering saw smaller groups continuing discussions, forming connections, making agreements to cooperate, and to share resources and information. Craftsmen agreed to travel between communities to provide services where they were needed. Farmers arranged to share tools and draft animals. Communities with surplus workers agreed to send labor to help other communities with critical tasks like planting or harvesting. Informal networks of mutual support began to form, connecting villages and manors across the region in ways that had not existed before the plague, when each community had been largely self-sufficient and when cooperation beyond traditional feudal obligations had been uncommon. Brother Edmund spent the weeks after the gathering compiling a report of what had been discussed and decided, a document that he intended to send to the bishop and to other authorities who might be able to provide resources or to implement policies that would support recovery. The report made for sobering reading. It documented massive population losses, widespread disruption of social and economic structures, urgent needs for food, labor, spiritual guidance, and governance. But it also documented adaptation and resilience, creative responses to unprecedented challenges, and the beginnings of recovery in many communities. Edmund's conclusion was that the situation, while dire, was not hopeless, and that with appropriate support and coordination, the region could rebuild over time. One of the most significant outcomes of the gathering was the decision to make it a regular event, to meet again in a year's time to assess progress and to continue the work of coordination and mutual support. This annual gathering would become an institution that would persist for decades long after the immediate crisis of the plague had passed, serving as a mechanism for regional cooperation and communication that helped to maintain social cohesion and to facilitate economic recovery. The gatherings would evolve over time, becoming more formalized and eventually being incorporated into the official governance structures of the region. But their origins lay in Brother Edmund's recognition that the survivors needed to come together, to share their experiences and their knowledge, to support each other in the overwhelming task of rebuilding civilization from the wreckage left by the plague. The agricultural year progressed, and the survivors across the region worked their fields and tended their animals, and tried to ensure adequate harvests to see them through the coming winter. The work was harder than in pre-plague years because there were fewer hands to share it, but it was also in some ways more satisfying because those who worked had more control over the fruits of their labor, and because the desperate scarcity of labor meant that workers could demand and receive better treatment and better compensation than had been possible in the crowded pre-plague economy. In the village of Rival, William the farmer and his neighbors successfully brought in a harvest that, while smaller than in years when the full population had been working the land, was more than adequate for the reduced number of mouths to feed. They had focused their efforts on wheat and barley on the best fields, had maintained their livestock carefully, and had been able to produce surpluses that they could sell or trade for goods and services they needed. The community had also successfully recruited several families from an even more severely plague-stricken village to the east, offering them good land and favorable terms, beginning the slow process of rebuilding population. In Sproxton, Sir Robert had reached an accommodation with his tenants, accepting reduced rents and labor services in exchange for their continued presence and their productive work on the land. It was not the arrangement he would have preferred. It diminished his income and his authority, but it was workable, and it was better than having empty lands generating no income at all. Sir Robert had also begun to see some advantages in the new system, particularly the fact that his tenants, having more stake in the productivity of their holdings, were actually producing better harvests than they had under the old system of compulsory labor service. that had given them little incentive to work efficiently. In Hutton-le-Hole, Eleanor, the widow, had eventually remarried to a widower from a neighboring village, whose own farm had been too small to support his family adequately, but who had the skills and the strength to manage Eleanor's larger holding. It was a practical arrangement more than a romantic one, but it worked for both of them, providing Eleanor with help she needed, and providing her new husband with access to better land. Their combined household was one of many similar arrangements formed in the post-plague years, as survivors pooled their resources and their labor to create viable economic units. As autumn turned to winter and the cycle of the agricultural year moved toward its dormant season, communities across the region settled into patterns that would shape their development for years to come. The old social structure had not then completely abandoned. Lords still existed. Peasants still worked the land. The church still provided spiritual guidance. The fundamental framework of medieval society remained in place. But within that framework, profound changes had occurred. Labor was valued more highly. Individuals had more autonomy and more opportunity. The rigid hierarchies had loosened. Geographic mobility had increased as people moved to take advantage of opportunities. Women had gained some measure of economic independence. The suffocating crowding of the pre-plague countryside had given way to a landscape where land was plentiful and where those who worked could reasonably hope to improve their circumstances. These changes were not uniformly positive. The disruption and uncertainty caused real suffering. The breakdown of traditional structures left some vulnerable. The loss of community cohesion that had characterized the crowded pre-plague villages meant that some survivors felt isolated and adrift. But on balance, for those who survived, the post-plague world offered possibilities that would have been unimaginable before the catastrophe. The Great Dying had been a horror beyond measure, but from that horror had emerged transformations that would reshape English society for generations to come. Brother Edmund continued his work at the priory, maintaining the divine office with his two fellow survivors, managing the priory's lands as best he could with reduced resources, corresponding with other religious houses and with church authorities about the challenges of the post-plague world, and planning for the second gathering of survivors that would take place in the spring of 1352. He also began writing a chronicle of the plague years and their aftermath, a detailed account of what he had witnessed and what he had learned from the gathering, a document intended to preserve for future generations the knowledge of what had happened and how people had responded. Edmund's chronicle would eventually run to hundreds of pages, filled with specific details about mortality rates in different communities, about the social and economic changes that had occurred, about the practical adaptations that had proven successful or unsuccessful, about the spiritual and psychological challenges that survivors had faced. It would become an important historical source, one of the more detailed contemporary accounts of the plague and its immediate aftermath, valued by later historians for its combination of personal observation and systematic compilation of information from multiple communities. But Edmund wrote it not primarily for historians, but for practical purposes, hoping that if such a catastrophe ever recurred, future generations would have the benefit of learning from this generation's experiences and would be better prepared to respond. The winter of 1351 to 1352 was relatively mild, and communities that had prepared adequately during the harvest season came through it without major losses. There were deaths, as there always were in winter, particularly among the old and the very young, But these were normal deaths, not the mass mortality of the plague years. The absence of plague through a full cycle of seasons gave people growing confidence that perhaps the worst was truly over, that the disease had burned itself out and would not return. This confidence was premature. The plague would return in lesser waves in 1361 and 1369, and at irregular intervals thereafter for centuries. But for the moment it allowed people to focus on rebuilding rather than simply surviving. Spring brought the second gathering of survivors to Helmsley, and the contrast with the first gathering was striking. The mood was less desperate, more hopeful. The attendance was larger, with more communities sending representatives and with some individuals traveling long distances to participate. The discussions were more focused on long-term planning rather than immediate crisis management, on opportunities rather than just on problems, on how to take advantage of the changed circumstances rather than just on how to cope with losses. One of the most interesting developments reported at the second gathering was the phenomenon of migration and resettlement. People were moving around the countryside much more than they had before the plague, leaving communities that had been severely depressed and moving to places where opportunities were better. Entire families were relocating. Craftsmen were traveling to towns where their skills were in demand. Younger people, in particular, were showing a mobility that would have been unthinkable in the pre-plague world where most people lived and died within a few miles of where they had been born. This mobility was creating a more dynamic economy and was helping to redistribute population more efficiently, moving people from areas of excess mortality to areas where labor was more desperately needed. But it was also creating social tensions, as established residents sometimes resented newcomers who were claiming resources and opportunities, as communities struggled with questions of who had rights and who belonged, as the stable, knowable world of the pre-plague village gave way to something more fluid and anonymous. The second gathering also saw the beginning of more formal organization and structure. Brother Edmund and several other leaders proposed the creation of a standing committee that would meet more frequently than once a year, and that would have some authority to coordinate responses to common problems and to represent the region's interests to higher authorities. This proposal was debated extensively, with some arguing that it was necessary for effective recovery and others worrying that it would create a new layer of bureaucracy and that it might be captured by particular interests. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A small coordinating council would be established, composed of representatives from different communities and different sectors of society, with limited authority to facilitate communication and cooperation, but without power to impose decisions on unwilling communities. This council would become an important institution in the region's recovery, helping to coordinate labor sharing at harvest time, facilitating the movement of craftsmen to where they were needed, compiling and sharing information about market conditions and about opportunities in different areas, mediating disputes that crossed community boundaries, and generally providing a mechanism for collective action that had not existed in the pre-plague world. Its success would inspire similar institutions in other regions, contributing to a gradual rebuilding of social organization and governance in the plague-devastated countryside. The years that followed saw continued recovery and adaptation across the region. Populations slowly stabilized and then began to grow again as birth rates increased and as immigration from more severely affected areas brought new residents. Agricultural production recovered and even exceeded pre-plague levels in terms of output per capita, as survivors working larger holdings with better tools and more livestock became more productive than the crowded smallholders of the pre-plague era. The towns and villages, while never returning to their pre-plague populations, became viable communities again, with functioning markets and adequate services and a sense of normalcy and continuity. The social changes that had begun in the immediate aftermath of the plague became more firmly established as new patterns of behavior and new expectations became normalized. The decline of serfdom, which had begun as a practical necessity when lords could not enforce their traditional rights over scarce labor, became a permanent feature of English society as free peasants and wage laborers replaced the bound villains of the pre-plague world. The increased status and economic opportunities for craftsmen and skilled workers became entrenched as guilds and training systems adapted to the new reality. The greater autonomy and opportunity for women, while still far short of anything approaching gender equality, represented a real, if limited, expansion of women's economic and social roles. Brother Edmund lived to see these changes unfold over more than 2 decades after the plague. He continued to organize the annual gatherings until his health began to fail in the late 1360s, and he saw the gatherings become established institutions that would continue after his death. He completed his chronicle, which filled several large volumes and which was copied and distributed to other monasteries and to secular authorities who were interested in understanding the plague and its effects. He trained younger monks to continue the prior recess work and to maintain its role as a center of learning and record-keeping. And he maintained his faith, though it had been tested and transformed by the experiences of the plague years, finding in service and in the work of helping others to recover a sense of purpose and meaning that answered even if it did not fully resolve the theological questions that had troubled him in the darkest days of the catastrophe. Edmund died in 1371 at the age of 63, having lived to see the region recover substantially from the plague and having contributed significantly to that recovery through his organizational work and his chronicling of the period. He was buried in the priory churchyard, his grave marked with a simple stone that identified him as a monk and a chronicler, but that said nothing about his role in organizing the survivors or about the larger significance of his work. But his legacy lived on in the institutions he had helped to create in the chronicle he had written, in the connections and networks that had formed at the gatherings he had organized, in the countless small ways that his work had contributed to the rebuilding of a society that had been brought to the edge of collapse. The story of the gatherings and of the recovery that they helped to facilitate was in many ways a story of ordinary people finding ways to cope with extraordinary circumstances, of communities adapting and improvising and gradually rebuilding what had been lost. There were no dramatic turning points, no heroic moments, just a steady accumulation of small decisions and small successes that eventually added up to something larger. Farmers planted their fields. Craftsmen practiced their trades. Merchants moved goods. Priests said masses. Families were formed and children were born and raised. The ordinary business of life continued, and in its continuation was the recovery. The gathering of survivors that Brother Edmund had organized was both symptom and cause of this recovery symptom, in the sense that it reflected the human need for connection and cooperation even in the worst circumstances, cause in the sense that it actually facilitated coordination and mutual support that made recovery more efficient and more complete than it would have been if every community had struggled in isolation. The gatherings created a collective experience of the plague and its aftermath, a shared understanding of what had been lost and what needed to be rebuilt, a sense that the scattered survivors were part of a larger community that was facing common challenges and that could work together to address them. This sense of community and common purpose was perhaps the most important outcome of the gatherings, more important than any specific practical measures that were adopted or any specific problems that were solved. The plague had atomized society, had destroyed communities, had left survivors isolated and alone, unsure whether anyone else had lived through the catastrophe. The gatherings brought people back together, reminded them that they were not alone, gave them a sense that recovery was possible because they could undertake it collectively rather than having to face it as isolated individuals. The transformation of English society that occurred in the decades after the Black Death was in many ways a product of this collective experience of catastrophe and recovery. The old social order had been based on assumptions about population density and labor scarcity and fixed social hierarchies that the plague had rendered obsolete. The new social order that emerged was more flexible, more market-oriented, more individualistic, offering more opportunity and more mobility, but also less security and less community cohesion than the old system. Whether this transformation was positive or negative depended largely on one's position in society and on what one valued, but it was undeniably profound and enduring. For the survivors who had gathered in Helmsley in the spring of 1351 and in subsequent years, the transformation was lived experience rather than abstract social theory. They saw their own lives change in concrete ways. They worked different lands under different arrangements. They earned different wages or paid different rents. They had different opportunities and faced different constraints than they would have had if the plague had never occurred. Some prospered in the new order, finding opportunities that had been closed to them in the old system. Others struggled, finding that the breakdown of traditional structures left them vulnerable and unsupported. But all lived through a period of fundamental transformation that made them witnesses to and participants in one of the great turning points in European history. The Black Death and its aftermath marked the beginning of the end of the medieval world and the slow emergence of something recognizably more modern. The changes that began in the plague years, the decline of serfdom, the rise of wage labor, the increased geographic and social mobility, the weakening of traditional hierarchies, the greater emphasis on market relationships, would accelerate over the following centuries, eventually producing the economic and social systems of the early modern period. The plague did not cause these changes in any simple sense. Many of the trends were already present in embryonic form before the catastrophe, but it dramatically accelerated them and made them irreversible. The gatherings that Brother Edmund organized were small events in the grand sweep of history meetings of a few hundred people in a provincial market town, dealing with practical problems of agricultural management and social organization in a limited region of northern England. But they represented something important about how societies respond to catastrophe, about the human capacity to organize collectively, even in the worst circumstances, about the importance of communication and coordination and mutual support in recovery from disaster. The fact that people devastated by the worst pandemic in recorded history could come together within a year of its ending, could share information and make plans and begin to rebuild speaks to a resilience and a determination that transcends any particular historical period. As the decades passed and as the memory of the plague faded from living memory, the annual gatherings evolved into more conventional market fairs and regional assemblies, losing their original character as crisis meetings of survivors. But they continued to serve important functions, maintaining the networks and connections that had been formed in the plague years, providing mechanisms for coordination and cooperation that helped the region to prosper in the post-plague period. And they were remembered in local tradition and in the written records as symbols of how the community had come together in its darkest hour and had found the strength to rebuild. Brother Edmund's Chronicle, meanwhile, became a valuable historical document, copied and studied by later generations who wanted to understand the plague and its impact. The Chronicle was remarkable for its combination of personal observation and systematic compilation of information from multiple sources, for its attention to practical details of how communities adapted and recovered, for its honest grappling with the theological and philosophical questions raised by the catastrophe. Later historians would mine it for data about mortality rates and economic changes and social transformations, but it also offered insights into the psychological and spiritual dimensions of living through and recovering from catastrophe, insights that remained relevant across the centuries. The story of the survivors gathering in Helmsley and working together to rebuild their world is ultimately a story about hope and human resilience in the face of overwhelming loss. The Black Death was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, killing tens of millions across Europe, destroying communities, shattering families, undermining faith, and calling into question the very foundations of medieval civilization. Yet from that catastrophe, recovery was possible. Not quick or easy recovery, not complete restoration of what had been lost, but genuine recovery nonetheless, the slow, patient work of rebuilding life and community and meaning from the fragments that remained. Brother Edmund and the hundreds of survivors who gathered in response to his call were part of that recovery, small players in a vast historical drama, but nonetheless important, their individual and collective actions contributing to the larger process by which medieval society reconstituted itself after the plague. They planted crops and raised children, and practiced trades and celebrated masses, and did all the ordinary things that constitute human life. And in doing those ordinary things, they achieved something extraordinary. They survived. They continued, they rebuilt, they demonstrated that even the worst catastrophes need not be final, that from the ruins can come renewal, that the human spirit, for all its fragility, possesses a strength that can endure even the great dying.